Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre and welcome to episode 10 of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today we're going to be talking about Blizzard. Now the previous episode was about Activision, so the team decided that it would only be fair if we go back and talk about Blizzard as well, because this is a two-part story, Activision and Blizzard forming Activision Blizzard. So we figured, hey, fuck it, why not? Let's go back and talk about them. And that's what we're going to be doing here today, but we're not doing it alone. I have three fantastic guest speakers who are going to be helping us with this episode today. The first is Lord Knight CalebCom. He doesn't really stream as much as he used to, but he's a huge fucking nerd when it comes to Activision, MechWarrior, and figurines and Warhammer and a bunch of stuff, so we figured he'd be the perfect person to do both of these episodes realistically. I think last episode he had a small guest speaking role for MechWarrior, and we knew that we wanted to have him back. He's just got a fantastic voice, fantastic attitude, just a great dude. The second is Purse. I know Purse personally. He's fucking fantastic. He's just a... You know what I'm saying? He's up there. Anyway, Purse is a personal friend of mine, fantastic streamer. He loves Mario, just a really good dude. And he's been wanting to be on these projects for a while, so I was like, fuck it, come on over. I know that you're gonna have a good time. And yeah, if you get a chance to check him out, I strongly suggest you do. Just a great community, great soul, just a great dude. And finally, the last person is the DOS nerd, who, as his name implies, is a massive nerd when it comes to DOS. And I knew that I'd have to pick out each of these individual people because they all have their own nerdisms for the content that we're about to talk about, so I was like, hell yeah, DOS nerd's gotta come along. Now DOS is a relatively new streamer. I haven't seen him on in a while, but we do keep in contact. He's a fantastic guy, and he is a dictionary when it comes to DOS games. Start to finish, Sierra, LucasArts. If it was on a PC, he's played the fuck out of it. And that's why he is more than welcome to talk about Blizzard and Sierra, because we're going to be mixing it up a little bit. There's no point in talking about Blizzard without bringing in Davidson, Sierra, and a bunch of other companies that were present during that time. So stick around. It's going to be a long episode, but it's going to be chock full of information that's going to be fun versus monotonous. So definitely sit back, relax, grab a drink, and enjoy the history of Blizzard Entertainment. Video games, the console, the player, and an experience like no other. From the early days of Pong to the contemporary games we know and love today, video games have evolved, and along the way, we've watched concepts come and go. But some companies made it from their early years and still are thriving today, which brings us to Blizzard. 1991 in gaming was a powerhouse year. EA released the groundbreaking motorcycle combat game Road Rash, RPG connoisseurs first explored the world of Neverwinter Nights, and Capcom would release the most powerful fighting game known to mankind, Street Fighter II. The SNES was power fisting the industry with the Genesis not that far behind, and we learned to embrace culture and use it to take over the world with civilization. The point is, 1991 was a breeding ground for greats, and it was also the year a lowly company by the name of Silicon and Synapse was created by Michael Morhaime, Alan Adam, and Frank Pierce. This group of friends all went to UCLA together and each contributed $10,000 to create their idea, and their first gift to the world would be J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings Volume 1, as well as Battle Chess 2, Chinese Chess. Now bear in mind the Lord of the Rings game was for the Amiga, which was actually a port. The original belonged to Interplay, but it's still worth checking out. Now the history of Blizzard was quick, it was turbulent, and in a way that mostly was related to quick knee-jerk exchanges, which made sense, because after all, this was a powerhouse year. Breaking into the industry would be a tough task, something that many companies failed to do, at least without the backing of major companies at the time, for example, Activision. Wouldn't it be nice to work with them one day?
The same year they were created, Silicon and Synapse would release their first console entry called RPM Racing, or Radical Psycho Machine Racing, for the SNES. It took only 5 months, which would give them the push for a sequel, Rock and Roll Racing, released 2 years later. This one was really pretty, had rather well-known rock music as a soundtrack, and ultimately gathered the attention of Software Creations. You know, the company that would eventually become Acclaim Studios Manchester? Yeah, full circle, huh? Interplay and Namco both put their seal of approval on the entry, with Namco pushing the game out in Japan and Interplay rocking the US markets. The game even won the Best Driving Game of 1993 by Electronic Gaming Monthly. They also released one of the most memorable puzzle platforming games of all times, The Lost Vikings. Now, this game was a cult classic featuring Eric the Swift, Olaf the Stout, and Balog the Fierce, which are kidnapped by an alien race and put into an intergalactic zoo. It's a fine mixture of comedic relief with actual no-bullshit puzzles that really get you going. It was beautiful for the SNES, and people loved it, to this day, you are guaranteed to see cameos of these three, so keep a lookout for them, World of Warcraft players. Anyway, from S&S was born the new idea of Chaos Studios. Pay attention to that font, because if you haven't recognized it already, you will soon enough. The independence of Chaos Studios wouldn't last very long. Remember when we said the 90s was a chance for companies to get a backing to some capacity? Well, Davidson and Associates did exactly that, to the tune of $6.8 million. For all accounts, Davidson and Associates was well known for edutainment games, such as Math Blaster, which I know you've played. And they have their own history, so we're going to try and parallel the two because Davidson's story is short and sweet. In the same year Silicon and Synapse was acquired, they went through a name change. The name change would go down as the start of an amazing journey into video gaming with Blizzard Entertainment.
When it comes to Business 101, there are always rules. For example, you may have a company, and that company will have competitors, and with competitors, you have to win. To win, you have to produce monumental products that will build your reputation. But one thing you have to consider is that while you're out there playing battle shits with another company, there's an even larger company waiting in the dark. So as a brief recap, Silicon and Synapse were changed to Chaos Studios and were bought by Davidson and Associates, and then they changed their name to Blizzard. Now, Davidson was for all accounts known solely for the Math Blaster series. During this time, though Davidson was making forgettable software, they did have enough money to pick up Chaos Studios. They also picked up a company called Learning Ways. Learning Ways is borderline impossible to find information on, but from what histories we could find, the company primarily made edutainment software, so we can assume the games were so dry that dogs were marking their territory with chalk. They also acquired Funny Bone Interactive, who made tons of games for example, Barbie and Her Magical House, or The Lie, yeah, a game called The Lie. If you look at all the games they made, it was quite apparent that they didn't really do much. I mean, everyone who was born in the 90s knew of Jumpstart, so hey, at least they contributed to our childhood in some capacity, with Jumpstart Music as well as Jumpstart Spelling. Then came Cuck. Cuck? Why? Okay. Pause. So, this, in 1996, this company was known as CompuCard International, who was practically controlling everything from financial services, home improvement, shopping, automobiles. Basically, Cuck was the Sears catalog of the video game industry. They bought out Davidson and Associates for $1.81 billion, and part of that deal was a little company by the name of Sierra Online.
Time to rewind a bit, because you know you're not gonna talk about Sierra without me here. Strap in and strap on, because we're talking about Sierra now too. Sierra started in 1979. Holy crap. That's old.
70s are old, huh? Yeah, well, get off my lawn.
Their original name was Online Systems. It was all the brainchild of a guy named Ken Williams, whose original job was to update dial-up systems for dealerships. And with the power of the Apple II, decided, like many of the greats in video game history, that he'd start developing games on this new medium. He quickly realized that for the most part, many of the games were text-only. What if someone went out and expanded upon that idea and took the traditional storytelling aspects of the text-based adventure and made them high resolution? You know, a true adventure game. Not like that riff-raff Zork. With success in developing general software, it was time to make a game. But not as online entertainment, but instead, Sierra Online. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? The first major game from Sierra would be Mystery House, with Ken's wife Roberta writing the script. It took roughly 3 months to make, and the outcome was phenomenal. People ate up the idea of this enhanced formula for adventure games, and Mystery House was super simple. Imagine what else they could do if given the chance. Well, this led to games such as Mission Asteroid, which led to Wizard and the Princess, which would serve to be the framework to one of the most well-known Sierra entries in the history of video gaming and adventure games as we know it, King's Quest. Sierra was doing great work in creating games up until the early 80s where it happened. The North American video game crash of 1984. Everyone wanted to make Atari 2600 games, and floppy disks were cheap to make. But Atari cassettes were a different story. You couldn't just copy that floppy. You had to pay a $6 fee to get multiple copies of Atari games. Many companies exited the gaming market, and Sierra survived by laying off literally all of their video game developers. Ken Williams decided it was economic to realign his former developers as contractors. A smart move. After the crash, many of the heavy-hitting titles from Sierra were created, starting a long line of legendary titles, starting with 1984's King's Quest, Quest for the Crown. The games were being pumped out, and for the most part, they were always the tits. Black Cauldron, Space Quest: The Sierran Encounter, and the King's Quest games were all leading the pack for the genre. One of the more popular Sierra entries was created by Chuck Benton, known as Soft Porn Adventure. It was purely text, which was different from the normal games, but that didn't stop people from buying it, leading to tons of sales. Eventually, this idea would be revisited by one of the more famous Sierra game developers, Al Lowe, extracting the topic matter of soft porn adventure, but making a totally new idea with ridiculous stereotypes, leading to the legendary tongue-in-cheek Leisure Suit Larry franchise. Eventually, Sierra would bring Jim Walls on board, who was a police officer, leading to the Police Quest line of games, all because of a friendship born from a racquetball court. Finally, in the late 80s, Quest for Glory was created. All in all, there were 4 different franchises kicking ass for Sierra, bringing in tons of money and leaving us with games to enjoy for years, even now, as adults.
Moving ahead to the 90s, it was time for Sierra to change up their formula just a little bit. Graphics were outdating, and the graphics that made King's Quest and Police Quest so successful were severely outdated. This led to a dramatic change in the game content created by Sierra. They branched out to release puzzle games like Dr. Brain and a darker quest game series known as Gabriel Knight. By 1996, they had also released Phantasmagoria, which is the best-selling adventure game that Sierra ever released. Then Cuck came around. Blizzard themselves were inspired by how Sierra was controlling the adventure genre, much like its competitor LucasArts, who was making games such as The Secret of Monkey Island and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. This in turn led Blizzard to try their hand at real-time strategy, creating the title Warcraft: Orcs and Humans in 1994, with a Mac OS version coming out 2 years later. Now we're caught up to the crossroads where all of these companies came together. Cuck would manage the operations and direction for Sierra, Davidson, Blizzard, Knowledge Adventure, and Griffin Software in 1996, and Blizzard on their own was still kicking ass and had a company by the name of Condor Games, making a little-known title by the name of Diablo. Okay, at the time it was little known, semantics guys. Condor would inevitably be renamed Blizzard North and would continue to release all future Diablo games in the franchise. To complement Diablo's release, Battle.net was born, an online gaming service that at first was incredibly minimal, with only a basic interface and options such as chats and a listing of games that were released. It would slowly grow over time thanks to future Blizzard releases. CUC or Cuck would continue strong as the Sears catalog of the video game industry, until 1997 when they merged with HFS Incorporated, creating a new company called Sendent Corporation, a massive undertaking that boosted all the companies beneath it. Sierra was breaking down their internal aspects and focusing on specific user markets. Davidson launched their Math for the Real World product, and Blizzard decided to try to get some of their IPs from Interplay. And they did, even going as far to remaking all of the early Interplay Blizzard titles for the Game Boy Advance. In 1998, Sierra officially finalized their internal lineup.
They did this by splitting into 5 different corporate divisions. The first was Sierra Attractions, which made casual games such as poker, trivia, and more, courtesy of Berkeley Systems. The second was Sierra Home, which focused on home software such as cooking, gardening, and home design. The third was Sierra Sports, which, as you may have deduced, was sports games, but more importantly, were sports games made by Dynamics, Synergistic Software, and Papyrus. Fourth was Sierra Studios, which created most of the 90s well-known adventure games. And finally, Sierra FX, which focused more on online multiplayer titles. They also gave a helping hand to Blizzard to publish Diablo Hellfire. But something wasn't right, and by not right, we mean cuck, was being a cuck all along. In 1998, the same year Sierra worked with Valve to create one of the most monumental titles of all time, Half-Life, cuck was busted on a massive accounting fraud. The guy in charge, E. Eric Shelton, had successfully inflated the company's revenue by a small, tiny, insignificant $500 million. Stocks plummeted, sales went down, and ultimately many people went to prison. This has resulted in Cuck being sold to Havas, which was formerly a news agency that turned into an advertising corporation. This caught the attention of a very specific company that was known for titles such as Crash Bandicoot, Fear, and several off-the-wall games. Vivendi. The remnants of Sendent were broken up into 4 different conglomerates. Realogy, Travelport, Wyndham Worldwide, and Avis Budget. That's right, Avis is related to Blizzard. Who'd have thought?
So we're now in the late 90s. Blizzard has released a sequel to the original Warcraft known as Warcraft 2: Tides of Darkness, which was a commercial hit, selling roughly 3 million units. But what now? How about a point-and-click adventure for the backstory of orcs, made by the same people who made the Legend of Zelda CDI games? No? Alright, thank God, that would have been rough. But what can we do? Diablo was already made and was highly successful, but the direction of gaming was moving towards 3D-based adventures, such as Grim Fandango by, you guessed it, LucasArts. So imagine this. You have a formula for 2 fantastic entries in the 90s, Warcraft and Diablo. And what do they share? They are both fantasy-related, they are both isometric, and they are both time-consuming games that involve the player making precision choices. How about we go to space? And that's exactly what they did, with the 1998 release of StarCraft to critical acclaim. This series created books, expansions, add-ons, and ultimately became the highest-selling game for the PC Spectrum, releasing over 11 million copies and creating an RTS element that supported multiplayer. It was one of the initial entries that kickstarted the esports craze, at least in South Korea. They ate up this game. But the late 90s weren't great for Davidson, who essentially merged with Knowledge Adventure, leading to the transition of Math Blaster, Reading Blaster, Fisher-Price, and Syracuse Learning, as well as Dr. Brain, a Sierra IP to Knowledge Adventure. Fortunately, Blizzard was able to remain its own entity, although Davidson was no more. Blizzard had a safe haven with the titles they were releasing. Warcraft 3 would be the next major release for them, but it took them quite some time to do it. At the ECTS, or European Computer Trade Show, in 1999, Warcraft 3 was shown to the public for the first time. Sierra wasn't doing so hot either. They laid off most of their employees, nixing companies such as Pyrotechnics and Yosemite Entertainment. Dynamics also was hit pretty hard, and in the end it was decided that Sierra would pull a Sega and exclusively publish from that point on. 2002 finally saw the release of Warcraft 3: Reign of Chaos, and for the most part, this is where Blizzard's history matters the most. Sierra and Davidson were either out of the spotlight or closed completely in Davidson's case, so it's time for Blizzard to shine.
It was a hot minute since Blizzard released anything heavy-hitting. Their primary franchises were Diablo, which had 2 releases, with the most recent at the time being Diablo 2, Warcraft, which had 3 titles, and StarCraft, which had remained untouched outside of an N64 port in 2000, so why not expand on that one? The idea was to create a militaristic stealth game for modern consoles. It'd fall under the StarCraft brand. As opposed to an RTS game, it was supposed to be a third-person shooter, developed by Nihilistic Software and Swing Ape Studios that Blizzard had just acquired, StarCraft Ghost. But it never came to fruition. It was supposed to be a universal cross-platform release, but it entered development hell, with all companies practically giving up completely on releasing it. But the public keeps a solid hope towards potentially seeing Ghost come into existence. But despite the failure of Ghost, Blizzard had another trick up their sleeve, an MMORPG surrounding the lore of Warcraft. World of Warcraft. As an MMORPG, it was highly successful, and players were essentially able to do whatever they wanted to do. From grinding to questing, dungeons, this game was a staple of PC culture in the early 2000s and beat out other MMORPGs at the time, such as RuneScape, EverQuest, MapleStory, as well as Star Wars Galaxies. It won tons of awards and still kicks ass even to this day, releasing numerous expansions and even releasing a classic version of the vanilla game we knew and loved. It was the sole product floating Blizzard until the late 2000s.
In 2007, Bobby Kotick, the CEO of Activision, proposed a merger with Blizzard, and after tons of deliberation, it was made official. Vivendi separated from the newly formed Blizzard Activision, and together, these companies began making games together. Namely, Destiny, which was made by Bungie, a subsidiary under the merger. Apart from everything that Activision was pushing, Blizzard was still pumping out amazing titles that would shake the world with every release. Most importantly, StarCraft II was released following the formula with a refreshing upgrade. Then they released Hearthstone and Heroes of the Storm, a card game and a MOBA respectively, again bolstering the esports possibilities, before dropping the multiplayer first-person shooter of the century, Overwatch. All in all, the story of Activision and Blizzard is one of consistent growth and faithfulness to its communities, even though Diablo Immortal is going to be a phone game. With Activision surviving the game crash and establishing the third-party developer concept, and Blizzard sustaining the esports community for years, both companies, individually and together, have become major staples of our childhoods, and will hopefully continue to surprise us for decades to come.
Now it's time to talk a little bit about the franchises that Blizzard, Sierra, and Davidson brought to the forefront of the industry. Are you ready? I know I am. Let's start it off obscurely with a game that you either remember or you don't. Personally, it's expensive as fuck to collect on the 32X, so I've experienced the SNES version, and it's like good for no reason. At least I enjoy it. You might not. You play as Kyle. It's an arcade platformer with tons of cinematic elements, and it's totally worth checking out if you want to play it, that is. And if you do want to play it, you can get it on the SNES, 32X, DOS, GBA, or even on Windows.
Well, we'll go ahead and knock out the obscure ports that Silicon and Synapse helped with during their earlier years, starting with Battle Chess, as well as Battle Chess 2, Chinese Chess. This was a cult classic spin on the classic board game, but it was primarily an Interplay IP. SNS did the work for the Commodore 64 releases for the first entry, and worked on the Amiga port for the sequel. The reason this game was popular was because the pawns would literally fucking kill each other. Then, as we mentioned, there was the Amiga Lord of the Rings game, which was an RPG, again by Interplay, but only the first game was developed by SNS. Do you like obscure simulation strategy games? Then maybe you'll like the 1992 release of Castles, where SNS made the Amiga port. Essentially, you build castles around Wales. It's your standard castle building game, and again, the sequel was not made by SNS, but instead, the company that made the main release, Quicksilver Software. Noticing a trend here? They made 4 games for the Amiga, 2 for the Mac, and 1 Mahjong game that was for Windows. As a standalone company in the early 90s, they had a tough time. But hey, it's always nice to look back and see what they had going on.
Diablo. The first Diablo entry was made by Blizzard North, which was Condor before Blizzard acquired them. Essentially, it is an action RPG hack-and-slash game released for Windows, Mac, and PlayStation 1. All the dungeons were procedurally generated, quests are totally random, with 3 classes to choose from. This is one of the staple action RPGs you have to play. It sold 2.5 million units by 2005, but remember, this is a PC game, and with successful PC games comes the opportunity to expand them, which is what Blizzard was notorious for, continuing a legendary game with even more options. This expansion for the first entry would be called Diablo Hellfire. It was a single-player continuation of the storyline. Honestly, it felt like a totally different part of the same game with different elements inside the same skeleton.
3 years later, Diablo 2 was released, this time only on the PC. It was one of the most popular games of 2000. It had many different elements. For one, instead of simply going deeper and deeper into dungeons, the consumer could enjoy varying environments and a convoluted armor system that was much more complex than the previous entry. And as always, multiplayer was a popular aspect of the title. It took place after the events of the previous game and takes place over 4 action-filled acts. It was massively successful at the time, selling 1 million copies after 2 weeks and 2 million after 1.5 months. Also, as was expected, an expansion was created called Diablo II: Lord of Destruction, which introduced 2 new character classes and an additional 5th act. It would be forever since we would see another Diablo entry, in Diablo 3, but it was under development for quite some time. It was announced in 2008, but development started for the title way back in 2001. But it wasn't until 2011 that beta testing was made available, and a year later, the game was officially released. It was beautiful, simply gorgeous. It used an engine that was a massive facelift from what people were used to back in the day, and again, takes part over an act-based story. This time, Deckard Cain and Leah are in Tristram, the same area from the previous games, trying to interpret a text about an ancient prophecy, only to discover cultist evils, much as was to be expected. This one sold massively as well, and led to 2 expansion sets, Reaper of Souls and Rise of the Necromancer, of which each added unique aspects to the game. Contemporarily, there has been talk about Diablo Immortal, which is going to be a phone game, and well, people weren't very happy about that. In fact, it was possibly the only time in BlizzCon history where the crowd booed the developers. Time will tell if this series will make the jump to mobile or die like so many games that tried in the past.
We aren't going to get too much into this series, just know that it was an edutainment approach from Sierra and Davidson, well, Knowledge Adventure. The 4 games that were released were chock full of various puzzles and challenges that really fucked me up as a kid, like stumped me. I was supposed to be learning stuff, but I never did. The one I played growing up was The Lost Mind of Dr. Brain, and yeah, I wasn't too keen on it. It was cool for like 10 minutes, and then it kind of just got boring.
Do you like Mario Kart? Well, then you probably won't like this game, because it's nothing like it. In fact, it's just a simple one-person perspective racing game. But what makes it interesting is that this game was a result of Sierra Online collaborating with Davidson. It is a wacky cast, and outside of that, it was a simple game. Seriously.
Oh, spoops! Yeah, mystery, spoops, and paranormal shenanigans. That's what Gabriel Knight's dating profile would say. This Sierra IP released 3 games since 1993, all of which are gems if you enjoy that style of gameplay. The first, Gabriel Knight: Sins of the Fathers, follows the titular protagonist, who is a struggling horror novelist going to explore a developing study about voodoo magic in New Orleans, Louisiana, the state Ford is from. Gabriel is voiced by Tim Curry, by the way, fun fact. Anyway, the game uses the traditional point-and-click format, and it was successful. The sequel, The Beast Within, a Gabriel Knight mystery, this time taking place in Germany, investigating a werewolf attack. This entry was a fucking banger. I strongly suggest you check it out if you get a chance. The story, the voices, the choices, and the music all just kick ass, and it's worth every second. The final game was Blood of the Sacred, Blood of the Damned, and it was a clunky jump to 3D for the franchise, but don't knock it. Outside of the cheesy voice acting and the rigid as fuck 3D, you can endeavor in the fact that the game is still fantastic. Not much is known for the future of this franchise, as Jane Jensen has already pitched the idea, but Activision doesn't seem too interested. Oh well.
Do you like funky games that taught you tons of stuff for no reason? Then welcome to Headline Harry, The Great Paper Race. This is a DOS-era game created by Davidson where you play as a reporter for Headline Harry, and you're racing against the devious Martin Muckraker. Essentially, you have to get proven wrong facts from becoming released to the public because a tabloid company is spreading absurd stories that are bastardizations about real news stories from 1950 to 1990, and it's a great mystery how to beat it, but hey, it totally works for people of all ages. It's a good game, but expect many dead ends. This game is like Myst without... well, it's not like Myst at all. Myst is playable, but hey, it's an edutainment game.
Hi-Res Adventures was a series that featured the first games ever released by Sierra Entertainment. The first title was Mystery House. Designed by Roberta and Ken Williams, this title was the first graphical adventure game, as well as the first title ever created by Sierra. It also has the honor of being one of the earliest horror games created. Essentially, you're in a mansion with a few other people, and you need to escape. Pretty simple, right? Well, it sold 10,000 copies, and in software talk in the 90s, it was a fantastic start. 10,000 became 80,000, and then it was released in Japan where it saw 100,000 copies if you combined all the Japanese computers it was ported to. It was a great game. Then they released Wizard and the Princess, which is believed to be what inspired one of the most famous IPs in Sierra's library, King's Quest. The game takes place in Serenia, where the king's daughter has been kidnapped by a wizard named Harlan. You just happen to be the sordid son of a bitch in charge of finding her. By the way, remember the land of Serenia. It'll be important soon. It sold 25,000 copies in 1982, and that would boost up to 60,000 by the end of its production. Then we had Mission Asteroid, which there isn't much information about, but according to the manual for the Apple II entry, oh wow. This is bland as bland can be. No wonder we can't find any information. This is a 4-page manual. Oh hey, an asteroid is blasting into Earth and you need to stop it from happening. Well, better get to it. There'd be 4 more of these high-resolution adventures, released from 1981 to 1983, but they diminished in value. Cranston Manor would be hit harshly by critics because of the text parser, as would the 5th game, Ulysses and the Golden Fleece. Then Time Zone came out, and people were mad because the game costed $99 in 1982, which is at least $263.41 nowadays. Can you imagine that? At least the final high-res adventure, The Dark Crystal, was successful, but that could be because of the film. These games set the framework for everything that Sierra would be known for. The rest is history.
When it comes to education games, you've got games such as Headline Harry, which covered social studies, and other subjects such as math, science, music, and English were all open for devs to create titles that would fit the bill for teaching your social deviant children the basic principles of education. Because fuck you, that's why. And the fact that by the time Kids Phonics came out in 1994, Earthbound was kicking ass on the SNES, and Warcraft Orcs and Humans by Blizzard, that was totally there. That was a thing. That was totally a thing. But hey, Kids Phonics won.
Oh boy, it's time for some King's Quest. This is a phenomenal and well-known series made by Sierra and pretty much kicked off the Quest frenzy in the 80s. This game featured Sir Graham going around and helping the King of Daventry and being charged to find 3 treasures. Now this game was stupid successful and was released several times. The first game was released in 1983 and had a minimal storyline. But with each re-release, namely the 1984 and 1987 re-releases, the story was expanded greatly. There also was an SMS port, and finally a well-known SCI engine remake in 1990, which is the one I personally suggest you to play. Just trust me, the early Sierra games and the way they were presented can be daunting, so playing them with updated graphics? Totally worth it. You can trust me, I have the word DOS in my name. The next game would be King's Quest II in 1985, which was ported to fucking everything, including the Tandy 1000, an off-the-wall IBM computer. Oh, by the way, this is the perfect time to teach people about graphics when it comes to DOS. You see, many of the early DOS games incorporated something called CGA, or Computer Graphics Adapter, which gave you 16 rudimentary, and I mean ultra fucking uber basic colors to work with. CGA is what most of the developers of games dealt with in early DOS titles. The second major update would be EGA, or Enhanced Graphics Adapter, which brought 64 colors to the fray and allowed games to look a little bit more presentable. But the most superior format would be VGA, or Video Graphics Adapter, which allowed for 262,144 colors and made games simply beautiful. So now you know when I say CGA, EGA, or VGA, you can kind of gauge what I'm talking about. Back to the game.
So, King's Quest II Romancing the Throne was a spoof of a 1984 movie called Romancing the Stone. and many of those elements bled over. Now, King Graham is going to get keys to unlock doors to save someone called Valenice, who is apparently the most sexy being this side of Daventry. As always, the humor was there, and the parser kicked ass. It was successful, and that caused an EGA remake in 1987. King's Quest III to Heir is Human changed the format a little bit. Instead of playing as King Graham, you take the role of Gwydion, who, as the story unfolds, you discover is someone totally different. But we don't want to spoil the game. People kinda didn't like it though. It didn't feel like a run-of-the-mill King's Quest game, but hey, that's what you get when you change the formula. King's Quest IV basically picked up where the last game left off, but again kind of mixes it up a little bit. It's hard to talk plot about these games because the immersion comes from the story. But you play as Rosella, the daughter of King Graham, on a quest to do things. It's a much more serious game than all the previous ones, and if you play it, you can tell that a lot of the jokes are practically non-existent, and in traditional Sierra style where you get funny moments throughout the games, you only hear the puns and quirks if you die. But it was massively successful, selling 100,000 copies in the first 2 weeks alone, and led to King's Quest as a series exceeding 3.8 million units in sales.
King's Quest V, Absence Makes the Heart Go Yonder, was the break into the 90s for the series, and we returned to an area Doss mentioned earlier called Serenia. You know, from Wizard and the Princess? Full circle. Anyway, you play as Graham once again, saving the entire castle he called home, which was stolen by a douchebag in a fancy coat. Literally. This game was also on the NES, wrap your head around that one. If you had the CD-ROM version, you even got voice audio. What a time to be alive! With VGA graphics, you would think this game would be the tits, but that was dependent on how loyal you were to the franchise. The NES port was slammed for being a horrible port, and the voice acting for the PC version, it was bad. In fact, many games that were released by Sierra in the future would poke fun at King's Quest V. The more you know, right? The final 3 games, 6, 7, and King's Quest Mask of Eternity, were part of the funky age of DOS games where graphics were phenomenal, but nobody wanted to make that 3D jump. In fact, King's Quest VII was fully animated and is highly reminiscent of another game, Torrens Passage. We'll get into that one in a second. The final game, Mask of Eternity, was the game that jumped to 3D, and oh man, was it a game changer. This game sold 750,000 units. King's Quest has come a long way since a parser to a full-on click adventure. But if you want a fresh re-imaging of the franchise, check out the Odd Gentleman's episodic quest game for contemporary consoles called King's Quest. It's worth it, plus it incorporates plot points from the first 6 games.
Oh man, you ready to talk sex? I'm ready to talk sex. This series is phenomenal because it follows an unlikely protagonist on a journey to get laid. Literally, that's all it is. It was made by Al Lowe, and through was the embodiment of Lowe's humor and creativity. The first game was Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, and features Larry Laffer, who is 100% unequivocally a virgin, and needs to go to Lost Wages, aka Las Vegas, to meet the woman of his dreams with his leisure suit and $94. It's a traditional adventure game in the style Sierra, but obviously the theme is more fine-tuned to adults, which isn't the first time they did it. Soft Porn Adventure was the first. But yeah, play the VGA version and the graphics are spicy, to say the least. There was a remake in 2013 called Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded, which is an HD remake of the original, but it's kind of shitty, so just do yourself a favor and endure the old graphics. The sequel, Leisure Suit Larry Goes Looking for Love in Several Wrong Places, was the follow-up in 1988. This time, it has probably one of the most convoluted plots, so here it goes. You get laid in the previous game if you beat it, well, the right way, and the narrator screws up the story. You win the lottery and end up on a dating show that is rigged, and then you end up talking to the KGB, and holy fuck, this is insanity. But it sold well. This time, for once, the game was not about the adult themes, but more so about the adventure aspect, which people didn't mind. This game was just as successful.
However, a year later, we would return to the more adult themes with Leisure Suit Larry 3, Passionate Patty, and Pursuit of the Pulsating Pectorals. Can't make this up. This one is the 37th best computer game ever, well, in 1994 at least. Plus, you get to play as more than just Larry. You can play as Patty on her adventure to find a sultry male stripper. This multiple perspective aspect would make a return in Leisure Suit Larry 5. Passionate Patty does a little undercover work, and it's the 5th. Wait, the 5th? Oh, yeah, the title is wrong. Leisure Suit Larry 5 is actually 4, but there wasn't an official 4th game released. Was it an inside joke or perhaps just an error on the developer's part? Well, luckily for us, we had the time to talk to Al though and get his side of the story. According to Al, he ran into a woman in the hallway who he hadn't spoke to in a while. In conversation, the individual asked Al if he was working on Leisure Suit Larry 4, to which Al responded, "No, 5, of course I'm working on Larry 4. And that one moment stuck as a permanent fixture of gaming history as one of the most sarcastic and hilarious inside jokes from none other than the master of tongue-in-cheek game designers known to mankind. Now, this game is exponentially easier than the others in the series, and if you want a direct start-to-finish Sierra game minus the deaths and dead ends, then definitely play this one. It's still a great title though, it sold 250,000 copies. There were 2 more entries in the Leisure Suit Larry main core line, but the final release, Love for Sale, was judged slightly for reverting to an older style of play, the text parser, but hey, to each their own. With the conclusion of the main line, we saw a rather contemporary approach to the title with Vivendi and High Voltage Software's Lovage series, which started with Leisure Suit Larry Magna Cum Laude, a totally different protagonist, the nephew of Larry Laffer, Larry Lovage, or Lovage, with about 5 times the amount of sex jokes, the nudity, and more. It had so much sex in it, in fact, that Australia banned it quicker than Traz on a hot Aussie day on Twitch. There was a sequel though with Box Office Bust, but it is a drastically different game and it's fucking horrible, so just don't even bother. If you want a game with a weird direction, check out Wet Dreams Don't Die. But remember, Sierra had nothing to do with this, so do not approach it as a traditional Sierra game. Ultimately, if you really want to enjoy this series, just play the original ones, they don't let you down. If you're a child of the late 80s or 90s, you probably remember Math Blaster, which was a Davidson IP that started with its initial release in 1983. This was one of those edutainment games that many people remember, much like Zoombinis, which was a Broderbund IP. Math Blaster was simple. You did math, nothing more, nothing less. The next entry was Algebra Blaster, and again it focused on math, but this time it was specific towards algebra as the title would imply. Now, if you've ever played Math Blaster, you might recognize this guy. Well, this is the 1980s, so he doesn't look like that yet. He looks like this, like a pissed off cabbage that understands math. Math Blaster Plus was essentially just a facelift of the original game, as was the next entry, Algebra Blaster Plus. Now it's time for the Math Blaster to evolve to what we remember as kids. Math Blaster Episode 1 In Search of Spot, released in 1993, was one of the most interesting math games at the time. You could do math, but you would also do missions that correlated to learning, so this was a surefire way to have action meets education, which again had a general plot, but with edutainment values, like always. With 4 levels and totally 90s 3D cinematics, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. It's kind of silly to talk about all of these games because they're practically all the same, so we'll make it simple. Davidson released 1 more Algebra Blaster title with Algebra Blaster 3 and 4 more Math Blaster games, with the last one developed by Davidson being Math Blaster for first grade in 1999. The IP has since been used by Knowledge Adventure, and it isn't dead by any means. Knowledge Adventure released several Math Blaster titles in 2013 for the iOS.
This is a standalone, but it must be in this script or else I'll probably scream various vulgarities at increasing intervals at 48 until it gets included. If you're hearing this, clearly I won. Checkmate. Anyway, Phantasmagoria was released in 1995 and is a beautiful game. It is live-action actions, cinematic quality scenes, and a fucking ridiculous amount of violence, which did lead to some controversy. But fuck me, this game is awesome! The story revolves around Adrienne Delaney, who is a mystery author trying to get inspiration for her next book, courtesy of the creepiest fuck house she just bought. As the plot progresses, well, you can experience that yourself. Roberta Williams, the developer, was pleased with it after it was all said and done. But you know who wasn't okay with it? the rest of society, more specifically, the media. They shredded this game alive because of the graphic violence that was in it. And during the heyday of Senate investigations into video game violence, this was right up there with Mortal Kombat's fatalities. But it's horror at its finest. And despite everything that happened, it was successful and a cult classic for gamers. There was a sequel called Phantasmagoria: Puzzle of Flesh, which followed a different protagonist by the name of Curtis Craig, who hallucinates and shit, and it's full of sex and butt cheeks and other fantastic things that made Sierra a household name in the 90s. Check this series out, you won't be disappointed.
Now, the Quest games were for the most part fantasy or surreal, but this approach was true to life when it came to police games at the time. There weren't many, so this Sierra IP was one that hit the ground running courtesy of a friendship between developers and Jim Walls, who was a former police officer. The first title was Police Quest: In Pursuit of Death Angel, and follows Sonny Bonds, who is a veteran on the police force who discovers throughout the plot that bad shit is going down. Compared to the other Sierra games, the jokes are minimal, the situations are very much real, and proper procedure is required, or else you will 100% game over. We do suggest playing the VGA version though, it's rough if you don't. The sequel Police Quest 2: The Vengeance brought even more mature and serious themes to the series, even including real-life scenarios that were incorporated into the game from Jim Walls' experiences as a police officer. The third and final game to be developed by Walls would be Police Quest 3: The Kindred, mostly in part because he left mid-development for reasons unknown. Altogether, the first three games accounted for over 850,000 sales, leading to the new guy, Daryl F. Gates, the former LAPD chief, taking over, with a refreshing concept that was generally new: SWAT. Now, for those of you who haven't studied criminal justice or aren't familiar with police history, Daryl F. Gates is the father of SWAT, the actual no-bullshit special weapons and tactics, which he created in 1965 to deal with hostage situations. This would carry over into his line of Police Quest games. The first was Police Quest Open Season, which was a drastic change. The graphics were super fucking realistic, which was awesome. The policies and procedures were even upped more, and if you messed up, you fail instantly, no question. When this game came out, people flocked to it. But another key point to bring up is that people also flocked to another game, Blue Force, made by, you guessed it, Jim Walls. But don't worry, Open Season did exponentially better than Blue Force. After Open Season, the franchise we now know as SWAT was born.
In the mid-90s, SWAT was released a somewhat tough response, because it was a drastically different approach, yet again to a series that was well known. But again, the game was keen on being hyper-realistic. If you skipped a briefing, the commander would scold you. If you went to the wrong place, the game would make fun of you. If you said the wrong word, it would game you over. Essentially, people who weren't prepared for this level of seriousness didn't fare well in the game. From that point on, SWAT essentially became solely a RTS, basically Rainbow Six without it being first person, and yeah, it wasn't great. SWAT 3 was however decent and even had some multiplayer modes, and it was in third person and played like Rainbow Six, so if you liked that style of gameplay, you had options. There would be 5 more games ranging from PC to PSP to PS2, but none of them really captured the magic of the franchise as it did in the 80s and early 90s. But something to bear in mind, Activision reopened Sierra in 2014, so who knows? Maybe we can see another Police Quest game. Even Jim Walls wanted to make a game called Precinct on Kickstarter, but it fell through, only making roughly $85,000 of the $500,000 that was requested.
Imagine if you took Sierra's popular adventure style of gaming and added RPG elements. You would have Quest for Glory. It's a pretty big departure from the normal aspects of Sierra games. For example, you'd have to rest, there's barely any dialogue for the protagonist, and there are real-time cycles in the game. From morning, afternoon, to night, you have to eat and drink, and basically it's a Sims meets RPG Sierra adventure. It was universally acclaimed and got a VGA remake in 1992. The sequel was just as funky. You had 30 in-game time days to beat it, or the game ended. It was tough too. The map was a bitch to navigate, and you could easily get stuck in a dead end, which would ruin your gameplay. But it was highly favored and led to another release in '92 called Wages of War. And much like before, it was a unique experience. However, the map was fixed and now had random encounters, so it was feasible for the most part, but some people felt it could have been better than it was. Oh well. There were 2 more entries, with the most recent being 98's Quest for Glory 5 Dragonfire, which sold about $500,000 worth of sales. It was also much more of an RPG than an adventure game. If you want to play these games, hop on over to GOG.com and buy the collection. If you like CRPGs, you'll love these.
RPM Racing was one of the early titles from Silicon and Synapse, the precursor to Chaos, and Blizzard that was a SNES racing game, one of the titles that Interplay released. Essentially, it was Pro-Am, but with little sprinkles on top, and if you're a Commodore 64 gamer, you might recognize this game if you cared about racing entries. This game is 100% Racing Destruction Set, an EA game released in 1985. RPM Racing was the remake. The more you know, right? There was a sequel, by the way, at least that's how it was planned. It's called Rock and Roll Racing, and it was released in 1993 on the SNES and Genesis. Originally, it was planned to be RPM 2, but it was changed. No biggie, the game is still fun.
If you haven't heard about Overwatch and you don't watch Twitch, personally, I don't know how you're watching this. Well, I mean, unless you're on YouTube. This is one of the high-level contenders for best esports games out there. Easily there with Apex Legends, Fortnite, League of Legends, Here's the Storm, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and more. It's a first-person shooter featuring a massive cast of characters, various modes taking place in a futurized Earth, and after an event called the Omnic Crisis, the United Nations creates Overwatch, a task force that is charged with restoring order. Honestly, the story and individual lores are worth its own episode with how they created it, but just know it's a highly successful game that originally was supposed to be an MMORPG. That's right, an MMORPG that wasn't WoW. Heresy! Treason! I mean, it never came to fruition. It was going to be known as Titan, and it was supposed to be an entirely new universe apart from the franchises Blizzard had at the time, namely StarCraft, Diablo, Warcraft. Honestly, there weren't a lot of details available about the project, but we're glad that they decided to transition the game to what we now know as Overwatch.
It's time for another quest series, this time in space. 2 key individuals made this game series possible, namely Scott Murphy and Mark Crow, who had previously done work on King's Quest II, so they were the chosen few to make a new, humorous approach to traditional adventure games. In the first entry, Space Quest Chapter 1, The Sierra Encounter, you play as an unnamed protagonist, but the default name is, and always will be, Roger Wilco. You travel across space and do a bunch of tasks trying to receive the Golden Mop, because you are a janitor on a spaceship known as Arcada. It had a few remakes, the most notable being the VGA variants, and in all existence of the game, it was massively successful, resulting in 1.2 million units being sold. It wasn't long before the sequel, Space Quest II, Chapter 2, Vohal's Revenge, would come to fruition, again featuring the same character, this time being transferred to a different area, still as a janitor, only to be kidnapped by Sludge. True story. It was successful and is considered to be one of the greatest Sierra games ever released. The next entry would be Space Quest III, and by now it was well established that this line of games would be a staple of Sierra. In fact, this was the game that officially gave the protagonist his name, Roger Wilco. It was universally acclaimed. Space Quest 4, 5, and 6 would all continue to be massive entries that helped bolster Space Quest, but 6 is where the line was drawn in terms of development. Will we ever see another Space Quest entry? Who knows? 6 sets us up for a continuation, but it never happened. Oh well.
StarCraft took flight in 1998, bringing the whole world to literally another part of our galaxy, known as the Kaprulu Sector. It involved 3 different species, the Terrans, the Zerg, as well as the Protoss. All these species are in an all-out war with each other because, like normal, humans exiled from anywhere are bound to just mess everything up. And the Zerg are essentially insect versions of the Borg. And the Protoss? They are basically the middlemen trying to avoid the daily bullshit with the Zerg. This game alone is considered one of the best-selling games of all time, and spawned numerous books, expansions, as well as a remake much later. The sequel, StarCraft II Wings of Liberty, well, it was exceptionally well received. Much like its predecessor, it featured the same base building system, but some of the aspects are changed heavily. namely the unit capability. Since its release, there have been 3 expansions, all adding to the baseline game. As mentioned, there was a cancelled game called StarCraft Ghosts, and it would have looked like this. A run-of-the-mill third-person game, but relevant to the StarCraft universe. Many people wonder how it would have been had it been created, but we'll likely never know. Regardless, this time-cherished franchise has contributed heavily to the South Korean esports community, and you will always see people playing it on Twitch.
Blizzard may have released some heavy-hitting titles for the 16-bit consoles, but there are 2 more that are kind of known, but not really, both of which were licensed DC games. The first was The Death and Return of Superman, which is based on the Death of Superman line, and it's faithful to the source material. It's a beat-em-up, and allows you to play as all the various forms of Superman from the arc. The other entry was Justice League Task Force, which was a fighting game featuring many of the members of the Justice League, but it was often considered subpar. It's close in art style to Eternal Champions. This puzzle platformer was a staple of Silicon and Synapse, and was one of the earliest games by Blizzard. You take control of Eric the Swift, Olaf the Stout, and Balog the Fierce, who are kidnapped and put into an intergalactic zoo, as we mentioned before. All the characters have their own unique traits, and to be honest, this game is simply addicting and a cult classic for retro gamers. It was hit or miss with sales, however, but that didn't stop Blizzard from pushing for another entry called Lost Vikings 2. It added a few more characters, but essentially came out late in the game in the 90s, and as such was subpar compared to puzzle platformers at the time. But that doesn't mean you should ignore this entry. All in all, the original trio of Vikings are long remembered in cameos and other appearances in future Blizzard games, and if you look hard enough, you're always bound to find them neatly tucked into most, if not all, Blizzard games.
DOS had his moment, now I get to have mine. This game is fucking fantastic. It is hands down my favorite DOS game on the planet, period dot. I love it. This was literally my first experience in PC gaming, second to MechWarrior, and holy fucking shit, it's a good game. I was 3 years old when it came out, but my grandparents received it as free software with the purchase of their computer, so hey, they got it for me when I was a kid. Torrens Passage is a child-proof entry that is meant to be played by a child with mystery elements, puzzles, and adorable and relatable relationships between 2 characters. But dying is still very much a thing in this game, and Al Lowe's puns are very much still around. Essentially, you're going to rescue your parents who were kidnapped, going through various lands to find the evil witch Licentia. Check this game out if you get a chance.
Warcraft is a household name, if not for the MMORPG, then for DOTA Defense of the Ancients or Warcraft 3. If you are a remote fan of the RTS genre, you must know this entry. Released in 1994 for the PC, Warcraft Orcs and Humans was one of the initial games to bring the concept of multiplayer to the RTS genre. You could play as orcs or humans, build a base, train your army, destroy your enemy in any way you can, surrounded by all the MS-DOS love you could muster. It wasn't incredibly successful, only bringing in about 300,000 units, but that didn't stop a sequel, Warcraft 2 Tides of Darkness, from being created a year later. This game was the commercial hit that brought attention to the series, selling 3 million units by 2001. It's funny to think that while most of us were playing Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask, this game was rocking on the PC spectrum, especially when compared to other companies such as Westwood, who was making the Command & Conquer series. It was, again, so successful that Blizzard wanted to make an expansion, this time called Beyond the Dark Portal. Also, there were additional level packs authorized by Blizzard, such as Maverick Software's The Next 70 Levels, which would be followed up by The Next 350 Levels. Then came the wonky idea of making an orc-based point-and-click title that would have been known as Warcraft Adventures Lord of the Clans. But it was going to be developed by Animation Magic, the fine people who brought us Wand of Gamelon, Zelda's Adventures, and Link Faces of Evil. If you're familiar with those games, you already know it would have been a gigantic shit show. After all, most Zelda fans don't consider any of the CDI games to be canon or even related to the franchise at all, and without a doubt the Blizzard community would have felt the same. But to be honest, looking at gameplay from the unreleased product, you can tell that Blizzard had a little say in how the art direction went. Maybe it would have been a cool game, but it didn't stand a chance. Warcraft Legends was slated to be the next major entry in the franchise, which would have been a radically different game from what was actually released, Warcraft 3: Reign of Chaos. In Legends, the game that was presented at ECTS 1999 showed the camera working over the shoulder to allow for a unique look at the units you would control, but by the time it was physically released, the camera was actually isometric like Diablo, and the graphics were still pretty cool. It also had the distinction of being the first 3D graphics rendered game by Blizzard, and reached universal acclaim because of it. Awarded Game of the Year by GameSpot and numerous other accolades, this was the Blizzard game at the time, and spawned one more expansion, The Frozen Throne, a year later. This title set the standard for future RTS from all companies, inspiring Defense of the Ancients 2 and leading to the success of games such as League of Legends.
Then it happened. The 2004 release of World of Warcraft, the subscription-based MMORPG that took the world by storm. This time you could select from either the Horde, which consisted of the Orcs, Tauren, Trolls, and Forsaken, or the Alliance, which had humans, dwarves, gnomes, and night elves. There were jobs to do, traits to improve, and tons of quests and raids galore that fit into the lore of the WoW universe. With music for every individual area and achievements galore, this game was the MMORPG upon its release. As with any Blizzard game on the PC, you're bound to see expansions. And boy, were there some expansions. The first was WoW: The Burning Crusade, released in 2007, which sold 2.4 million copies the day it was released. It brought in 2 new races, the Draenei and the Blood Elves, introducing the no bullshit Dark Portal leading to the Outlands, and introducing the Burning Legion as a major plot point, and ultimately tying in the events from Warcraft 3: Reign of Chaos, which would inevitably lead to the inspiration for the next expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, which was tied to Warcraft 3: The Frozen Throne. Before then, you had Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms, and the ability to go to the Outlands. With Wrath of the Lich King, the frozen continent of Northrend was introduced, as was the Death Knight class. Then there was a Cataclysm, literally with World of Warcraft Cataclysm, which brought back Deathwing the Destroyer, who was last seen in Warcraft 2. Since then there have been 4 more expansion releases: Mist of Pandaria, Warlords of Draenor, Legion, and Battle for Azeroth. We aren't going to get into all of the technicalities of the individual expansions because that ultimately would take up hours alone, but just know they all added individual upgrades to the core game, and it's worth checking out if you have time to dedicate solely to one game.
Then we had some off-the-wall releases that were kind of different than Warcraft, but still maintained the elements from the lore. For example, Hearthstone, which is a card game. And you essentially battle Yu-Gi-Oh! Style without the Shadow Realm and plot points, but yeah, it's a pretty good game. We were also exposed to a re-release of Warcraft 3 that's upcoming called Warcraft 3 Reforged, which if you haven't checked out, looks pretty fucking great. And if you really didn't like the expansions for WoW, then you could play WoW Classic, which tons of people are freaking out about. And essentially, it's just the original game minus all the quirks that made it, WoW. Outside of that, there have been 5 different boards, a trading card game, and a metric fuck ton of books and comics released. Check this series out if you enjoy classic gaming that successfully bridged the gap to contemporary times. In closing, it's fair to say that these companies all had tons of games, and it would be incredibly difficult to cover every single one of them. Sierra alone had 82 titles, and it's still around making games with Activision. I strongly suggest you go check them out. For example, codename Iceman that was released with the help of Jim Walls, the developer of Police Quest, or even A Colonel's Bequest and The Dagger of Amon-Ra, 2 more fantastic games.
Between Blizzard, Sierra, and Davidson, these companies together, with the help of Vivendi and eventually Activision, created a safe haven for a PC gaming experience like no other. And to this day, we can remember the feeling of seeing these games unfold in front of us. We don't know what direction Activision or Blizzard together will take, but hey, props to them for molding and creating our childhoods the way that they did. One piece at a time, one memory at a time, from the dead, hollow, and chilling winds of Tristram.
To the mechanical stench of Fuel and Death and MechWarrior, these titles ushered us into a new generation of gaming that was far beyond its time when compared to other games. And now, as adults, we get to reap the rewards of knowing what it felt like to see these games from conception all the way to what they have become now.
Staple entries of not only our childhood, with their gritty in-your-face elements, but our children's lives as well. Our quests have long been over, and now our new quest begins, sharing the histories of these influential titles for a generation that will likely never know nor understand the power of Sierra, Blizzard, and Activision.
That was a lot of information. I love Blizzard. I've always loved Blizzard. I was kind of a late bloomer, personally. I played Warcraft when it was far too late. And I knew people who played Warcraft 3 all the time in school, but never put two and two together that, hey, this is what World of Warcraft will become. And I was a late bloomer, like I said. But anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I greatly appreciate it. If you like what you saw, hit that red subscribe button down there. Hit the bell so you know whenever I'm releasing new content. We keep these videos going. We love making them. They're always a blast. And by the way, thank you so much, Al Lowe, for taking the time to call me, or actually I called him on the phone, and tell us a little bit about the insight of Sierra. He helped us out with a lot of stuff that we couldn't really hash out. We made some mistakes, and he took the time to help us out, and that was fucking phenomenal. So thank you so very much. I cannot overstate like how grateful I am that you took the time to do that for us. So if you're watching this, thank you. But as always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Ready Go Gaming Show out.